The grand ballroom was alive with music and laughter, a swirling tapestry of sound and movement that carried a certain intoxicating charm. At its heart stood Amanda, wrapped in a red dress that clung to her like a second skin, vibrant and almost too alive. In her hand, a champagne flute caught the golden, flickering glow of the chandeliers, reflecting the illusion of perfection that hung in the air. Tyler, her ever-charming colleague, leaned in closer, his smile lingering just a beat too long. "Amanda," he murmured, his voice smooth, honeyed with flattery. "You look absolutely stunning tonight." Amanda's lips curved into a slow, knowing smile, a fleeting glimmer in the gilded night. Across the room, her husband, Matthew, watched in silence. Lately, he was always watching. Observant, quiet, his gaze weighed heavy with unspoken thoughts, ones Amanda either didn't notice or deliberately chose to ignore. A dull ache settled in Matthew's chest as he took in the scene before him. The way Amanda laughed with Tyler, the effortless touch of her hand on his arm, it was natural, easy, too easy. A cold knot tightened in Matthew's stomach. His mind churned with memories of late nights, of hushed phone calls Amanda struggled to explain. Tonight, he stood at a crossroads. He could look the other way, pretend none of it was happening. Or he could step forward and face the truth head-on. "May I cut in?" His voice was level, steady, as he extended his hand toward Amanda, his expression composed yet unreadable. Amanda's eyes flicked to him, barely masking her irritation. "Oh, Matthew, can't you see I'm busy?" For a moment, silence stretched between them, fragile yet deafening. Something subtle but irreparable cracked in that instant, like a hairline fracture in glass, silent, but destined to spread. Matthew's expression remained calm, almost unsettlingly so. But his eyes were a storm, brewing with something deep and unresolved. Amanda met his gaze, momentarily trapped in it, but within her own, a spark of defiance burned. Tyler, sensing the shift, gave a casual grin and lifted his hands in mock surrender before slipping away into the crowd, leaving husband and wife in the tense quiet of a bustling room. "What do you think you're doing, Amanda?" Matthew's voice was low, barely above a whisper, yet every word carried a sharp edge. Amanda laughed, light and dismissive, but the sound was dull, hollow. "Relax, Matthew. It's just a dance." His jaw tightened as he stepped closer, his voice dropping to something colder. "A dance? You've been flirting with him all night. Do you really think I don't notice?" Amanda rolled her eyes with exaggerated indifference. "You're being ridiculous." "Ridiculous?" Matthew's voice teetered between disbelief and fury. "The late nights, the secretive conversations, do you think I'm blind?" Amanda exhaled, her patience wearing thin. There was something final in her tone when she spoke next. "Matthew, I'm not your possession. I don't have to explain every detail of my life to you." Her words landed with a weight that felt different this time, heavier than before. Matthew heard something in her voice that chilled him, not just distance, but something sharper. Was it indifference? Or had it become something worse, contempt? His heart pounded, the bitterness of restraint unfamiliar on his tongue. Then, with a steady breath, he made a choice. "If that's how you feel, maybe we need to reevaluate our marriage." Amanda's gaze softened, just for a moment, a flicker of something real. But then, just as quickly, her expression shut down, a shrug replacing anything genuine. "Maybe we should." Matthew took a step back, his body stiff with the weight of her words. Around them, the party carried on, the music, the laughter, the clinking glasses. But to him, it all sounded muted, distant, like background noise in a life that no longer felt like his. "So that's it?" he asked, but Amanda's silence said more than any words could. He held her gaze for a moment longer, something resolute settling within him. He knew he couldn't let the weight of this evening dissolve into another unspoken, ignored reality. Turning on his heel, he moved through the crowd, weaving past bodies wrapped in their own fleeting moments of joy. In the quietest corner of the ballroom, his hands trembled, not with fear, but with something sharper, something decisive. Pulling out his phone, his mind locked onto a single contact. The line rang once. Then, a familiar voice answered. "Hello." Matthew exhaled, his grip tightening around the phone as a cold clarity settled over him. "It's Matthew," he said, his voice steady, controlled. "I need your help." The response on the other end of the call was warm, steady, an anchor Matthew hadn't realized he would need to grasp onto so tightly. Their conversation was brief, just a few weighted words exchanged before he ended the call, exhaling like a man surfacing from deep waters. Across the ballroom, Amanda had returned to Tyler's side, champagne in hand, sipping with renewed enthusiasm. Her laughter bubbled back up, light and effortless, but hollow. Tyler, ever the observant one, studied her for a fleeting moment before offering another drink. His concern flickered across his face, so brief it could have been imagined. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice tinged with an almost imperceptible hesitation. Amanda brushed it off with a casual grin, waving a dismissive hand. Matthew just needed a little reality check. "We'll be fine." The words came out smoothly, more as a declaration to herself than anything else. But as the evening wore on, the rush of champagne and feigned indifference couldn't smother the gnawing unease creeping in. Every laugh, every fleeting touch against Tyler's arm, left a strange emptiness in its wake, like a cold wind passing over dying embers. She stole a glance around the room, searching, but Matthew was nowhere to be found. And somehow, his absence weighed heavier than his presence ever had. Still, it was too late for second thoughts. The cracks had formed, and deep down, she knew they would only grow wider. They left the gala separately, each locked within their own silent fortresses, invisible walls rising higher between them. Outside, the city hummed with its usual restless energy, but between them, an uneasy truce settled in the night air. Neither one turned back. Amanda arrived home alone, greeted by a silence that felt foreign, as if she had stepped into someone else's life. She closed the door gently, the quiet pressing in around her. Her heels clicked against the polished wooden floor, the sharp sound feeling out of place in the eerie stillness. Her gaze flickered across the dimly lit living room, almost expecting to find Matthew perched in his usual chair, watching her with that same unreadable expression. Or perhaps leaning against the kitchen counter, arms crossed, his quiet intensity filling the space. But the house felt untouched, as if time itself had stalled. With a weary sigh, she made her way to the bedroom, pressing her fingers against her temples as a headache began to take root. She flicked on the light, and froze. At the foot of the bed sat an open suitcase, mostly empty except for a few scattered belongings. A shirt. A watch. A pair of worn leather shoes she had once teased Matthew about, calling them too serious for him. Beside the suitcase, a single note lay stark against the neatly made bed. Her breath hitched as she stepped forward, every movement amplifying the sound of her own heartbeat. She reached for the note, her hands trembling slightly as her eyes scanned the familiar, unmistakable handwriting. "Amanda, you have until midnight to leave town. Matthew." Her gaze traced the words again and again, searching for some hidden meaning, some loophole that might change the weight of what she was reading. But there was none. The message was as blunt and unyielding as the look he had given her at the gala. Her fingers curled around the paper, crumpling it as disbelief rippled through her. How had it come to this? What had she missed? The evening replayed in her mind, the laughter, the careless words, the moments she had dismissed. She could still hear the echo of her own voice, light and forced, an empty melody masking something deeper. She had thought she was in control. She had believed she was merely reclaiming a part of herself. Then the door creaked open behind her. Amanda spun around, her pulse spiking, half expecting to see Matthew standing there, ready to finish whatever this was. But it wasn't Matthew. Tyler stood in the doorway instead, his eyes bloodshot, his face shadowed with exhaustion. His shirt was rumpled, his expression dazed and uncertain, as if he had only just woken up to a reality he hadn't been prepared for. "Amanda," he murmured, rubbing his forehead. "What's going on?" Relief washed over her, sudden and fleeting, a false sense of stability in the chaos. But when she opened her mouth to speak, her voice wavered. "Matthew found out," she admitted, her grip tightening around the crumpled note. He's telling me to leave." Tyler's face shifted, concern was there, yes, but beneath it, something else lurked. A hesitation. A flicker of regret. "Leave," he echoed, his brow furrowing. "Just like that? Why so suddenly?" Amanda shook her head, her fingers smoothing over the wrinkled paper as if searching for some answer, some clue she had missed. "He didn't explain," she whispered. And that was the truth. Matthew hadn't needed to explain. The note had said enough. "He just told me to go. To get out." Amanda's voice barely carried in the still air between them. She met Tyler's gaze, searching for something, reassurance, maybe, or understanding. And it was there, that quiet support he always offered, but without the weight of shared years, without the wounds and history that had etched themselves into her and Matthew like old scars. In that moment, the connection she had believed was there with Tyler felt different, thinner, fragile. Like a lifeline coming undone strand by strand right before her eyes. "Maybe you should call him," Tyler suggested, his voice softer now, uncertain. Amanda nodded, fumbling for her phone, but as she pressed the power button, her stomach dropped. The screen remained dark, dead. Her hands shook as she grabbed her charger, plugging it in, watching anxiously as the device flickered back to life. The moment it had enough power, she dialed Matthew's number. With every ring, her pulse quickened, her panic tightening like a noose. One ring. Then another. Each unanswered tone felt like a door slamming shut. When his voicemail finally clicked on, she flinched, as if she'd been struck. The phone slipped from her grasp, hitting the floor with a hollow clatter. "He's not answering," she whispered, more to herself than to Tyler. Tyler sighed, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. Maybe you should give him some space. Just leave for a little while. Let him cool off." Amanda lifted her gaze, desperation raw in her expression. "But I don't want to leave him. I just wanted to feel alive." Tyler finished quietly, his words heavy with a knowing sadness. She nodded. But now, saying it aloud, the truth only deepened the ache in her chest. She had wanted freedom, excitement, some fleeting glimpse of the woman she thought she had lost. But standing here, surrounded by the wreckage of her choices, those desires felt hollow. Selfish. "I need to stay," she murmured, the words barely more than a breath. "I need to explain. To make him understand." Tyler hesitated, his hand slipping away. "Amanda, maybe you're just holding on to the idea of him. But sometimes." He trailed off, glancing toward the door. "Sometimes we lose what we have to find who we are." His words settled over her like a slow, suffocating weight. In chasing something new, something thrilling, had she lost the one person who had truly known her? Midnight loomed closer, ticking toward her like an executioner's countdown. She paced the living room, her reflection stretching and warping in the darkened windows. The silence pressed against her, thick and unrelenting, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the clock. Her eyes swept the room, landing on the remnants of her life with Matthew, the framed photos, the books he had left scattered on the coffee table, the old blanket they had bought on a spontaneous road trip. Each object carried a story, a fragment of the life she was now being forced to leave behind. And suddenly, indignation flared up inside her, sharp and fierce. How could he do this? How could Matthew, after everything, cast her aside like she was nothing? They had built a life together, endured each other's flaws, laughed at each other's quirks. How could one mistake, one moment of weakness, erase all of that? Snatching up her phone, she scrolled through their old messages, desperately searching for some trace of warmth, some proof that this wasn't the same man who would throw her away like a stranger. But the messages only confirmed what she already knew. Every text was carefully worded, distant. The effortless affection that had once filled their conversations had vanished, replaced by something cold, measured. Then, the screen vibrated in her hands. A new message. Her breath hitched as she opened it, her fingers trembling. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't regret. It wasn't even a question. Leave by midnight, or the consequences will be worse. I have everything documented. Matthew. The words cut through her lingering defiance like a blade. Not only had Matthew seen through her, but he had proof. The weight of Matthew's words pinned her in place, suffocating in their finality. Each accusation he hadn't yet spoken hung between them, unspoken but undeniable. In an instant, Amanda's resolve shattered, splintering into jagged edges of panic and regret. Tyler's voice cut through the silence, steady but cautious. Amanda, he murmured, stepping closer, his tone laced with sympathy. Maybe it's time. Go somewhere else. Give yourself some space. He's hurting, and anything you say now is only going to make it worse. Amanda shook her head, her breath catching in her throat. But if I leave, what do I have? This is my life. My home. I can't just walk away. Tyler placed a firm but gentle hand on her shoulder, anchoring her in the middle of the storm brewing inside her. You have me, he said, his voice sure, unwavering. We'll figure this out together. But you need to go, Amanda. After that message, staying will only make things worse. For a fleeting second, she almost believed him, grasping at his words like a lifeline. The certainty in his eyes, the quiet conviction, it was the kind of reassurance she hadn't felt in months. Maybe even years. But deep beneath the surface, a quiet ache throbbed. Tyler wasn't Matthew. He never would be. The thrill, the attention, it had been intoxicating, but it lacked the unspoken understanding that had once bound her and Matthew together. Yet, as the walls of her life closed in around her, the weight of Matthew's ultimatum pressing against her ribs, Amanda felt her defenses crumble. She needed a refuge, a space to unravel the chaos inside her without his gaze, without the heavy silence of his disappointment. With a sigh of resignation, she turned and began gathering a few belongings. Her hands trembled as she shoved clothes into a bag, each item feeling less like luggage and more like fragments of a life coming undone. A shirt. A sweater. The small things that made up a home. She glanced up to find Tyler watching her, his face half hidden in shadow, and something unspoken settled between them, a quiet sadness, lingering but inevitable. He was offering her a way out. But at what cost? A few moments later, they stood by the door. The weight of her suitcase in her hand felt like an anchor, pulling her back toward everything she was leaving behind. She hesitated. One last look. Her gaze swept across the living room, drinking in the echoes of what once was, the warmth of shared laughter, the quiet comfort of nights spent curled on the couch, the way Matthew used to stand in the kitchen, coffee in hand, watching her with that quiet intensity. She reached out, her fingers brushing the doorframe, as if trying to hold on to something, anything, before it slipped away forever. Tyler's voice pulled her back. Amanda, let's go. She blinked, the moment breaking like fragile glass. With a dazed nod, she stepped out into the cold night air. Every step forward felt heavier than the last, the weight of Matthew's ultimatum pressing against her like an invisible force. The house, her home, grew smaller behind her with each movement, until it was just another dark shape in the night. Tyler loaded her suitcase into the trunk, and as she turned for one last glance, something inside her twisted. Longing. Remorse. The quiet, crushing recognition of everything she had risked. Midnight had come. And with it, the realization that she had crossed a line. one from which there was no turning back. The car engine roared to life, its sound deafening against the stillness. And then, without another word, Amanda turned her back on the life she had known. On the love she had held. On the person she had once been. The house disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the silence. Amanda sat rigid in the passenger seat, the hush between her and Tyler thick as fog. Only the low hum of the engine filled the void, interrupted by the occasional rattle of her suitcase shifting in the back. Streetlights passed in rhythmic intervals, washing over her face, illuminating the raw shock etched into her features. She barely registered the streets blurring past. The familiar storefronts, the cafes she had once visited, the turns that led home. But home no longer existed. And for the first time, she realized she had no idea where she was going. Her mind was still tangled in that last, lingering look at the house. The quiet stillness she had left behind, the finality of it settling in her chest like a dull ache. Beside her, Tyler shot a cautious glance in her direction. His expression was soft, but there was something else there, uncertainty, maybe even hesitation. He reached across the center console, his fingers wrapping around hers in what was likely meant as reassurance. But Amanda felt nothing. The warmth of his hand barely registered, her own hanging limply in his grasp. What had once felt thrilling, bold, even, now felt foreign. A stark reminder of the choices she had made, each one leading her down a path she had never truly envisioned for herself. "You want to talk about it?" Tyler's voice was quiet, careful. Amanda turned toward him slightly, her gaze flickering over his face. She parted her lips, ready to speak, but the words she needed to say crumbled before they could take form. What could she say? That she regretted it? That she felt an aching, unbearable loss she hadn't prepared for? That sitting here beside him now, she realized just how empty this whole thing had been. Instead, she just shook her head. Her voice barely carried above a whisper. "I don't even know where to start." Tyler gave a small nod, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, though his fingers tightened slightly around the steering wheel. "I get it. You're processing." His words hung between them, an attempt to bridge the silence that neither seemed capable of breaking. Minutes stretched by, thick with unspoken thoughts. Outside, the city rolled past them in fragments, darkened shop windows, street signs glowing faintly beneath the streetlights, the occasional lone pedestrian lost in their own world. Amanda's mind buzzed with pieces of a life now slipping through her fingers. Matthew's laugh. The quiet way he listened. The look of betrayal carved into his face tonight, something raw, something permanent. She wondered where he was now. What he was doing. Whether he felt the same hollow emptiness she did, or if he was relieved, finally freed from the weight of them. After what felt like an eternity, Tyler spoke again. "Look, Amanda," he started, his voice measured, deliberate. "I know this isn't how either of us expected things to go. And I know," he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I know you have a lot on your mind. But I meant it when I said I'd be here for you, okay? I'm not going anywhere." Amanda turned her head, meeting his gaze. For a moment, she searched his face, looking for comfort, for something to hold on to. But instead, she found a quiet divide between them, one she hadn't noticed until now. To Tyler, maybe this felt like a beginning, the start of something new. But for her, it was an ending. An irreversible, devastating end to something she had once cherished. She forced a small nod. "Thank you, Tyler." "Really?" The word sounded distant, almost rehearsed, even to her own ears. They continued driving, the city gradually giving way to winding back roads. Tall trees flanked the narrow street, their long shadows stretching over the car, swallowing what little light remained. Amanda's thoughts felt just as dark, heavy with everything left unsaid, everything she hadn't realized she had been throwing away until it was too late. "Where are we going?" she asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the stillness. Tyler glanced at her, his brow furrowing slightly. I figured we'd go to a hotel. Just for the night. Until you figure out what you want to do. There's a quiet one just outside the city. Amanda nodded, but an unsettling weight settled deep in her stomach. A hotel. A temporary place for people caught between destinations, trapped in transition. It felt fitting. She wasn't a part of the life she had left behind anymore, but she wasn't truly part of the one Tyler seemed to offer either. She existed somewhere in between, untethered and directionless. They pulled into a small gravel lot, the muted neon glow of the hotel sign flickering overhead in tired, faded blue. Tyler shifted the car into park, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. The engine ticked as it cooled, filling the silence with its soft, rhythmic clicks. Amanda's hand drifted to the door handle. But she hesitated. A strange reluctance clawed at her, pressing against her ribs like something heavy, something undeniable. You okay? Tyler's voice was soft, but there was something in it, something searching. Amanda nodded, though she wasn't sure she meant it. Yeah, just a lot to take in. Together, they stepped into the hotel, the air inside cool and sterile. The receptionist barely looked up as she slid the key across the counter, her disinterest only deepening the surreal weight of Amanda's reality. She gripped the key tightly, as if holding on to something tangible could steady the chaos inside her. The dim hallway stretched before them, the worn carpet softening their footsteps as they walked. The place smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old air conditioning, the kind of scent that clung to hotels meant for passing through, not for staying. Inside the room, Amanda turned to Tyler, mustering a small, exhausted smile. Thank you, for everything tonight. Really? Tyler leaned in, pressing a light kiss against her forehead, his touch lingering just a second too long. I'll be down the hall if you need anything, okay? She nodded, watching as he stepped back and slipped out, closing the door softly behind him. And then, at last, she was alone. The silence pressed against her, thick and unyielding. Amanda glanced around the room, bare walls, stiff sheets, a generic landscape painting hanging slightly crooked over the bed. Everything about it felt temporary, impersonal. A hollow place for a hollow moment. This was it. This unfamiliar space. This endless night. This fractured version of herself. She sank onto the edge of the bed, staring at the faded wallpaper, feeling a slow, gnawing emptiness settle deep in her chest. She had left everything behind. Crossed every line. And for what? To sit here, alone, in a room that didn't belong to her, with a man she barely understood? Somewhere out in the city, Matthew was there, probably nursing the same raw ache in his chest. But she doubted it felt the same. Because in that silence, in that emptiness, she realized something more painful than anything else. Tonight, she hadn't just left her home. She had left herself behind too. Amanda lay back on the stiff mattress, staring at the ceiling, the dim glow of the room pressing down on her like a weight. Shadows crawled along the walls, her restless mind twisting them into shapes that dissolved as quickly as they formed. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time she drifted, another memory jolted her awake. Finally, she sat up, hugging her knees, feeling unmoored in this cold, sterile place, so far from the familiar textures of home. Her thoughts ran in circles, replaying the past few months like a fever dream. She traced the cracks in her marriage, trying to pinpoint the moment it had started to fall apart. But it hadn't been one moment, not some explosive fight or a single betrayal. It had been quieter than that. A slow erosion of connection. Conversations left unfinished. Long silences that neither of them had the energy to break. Nights spent side by side but galaxies apart. She had drifted. And somehow, she had assumed Matthew would either drift with her, or pull her back. Then came Tyler. Easy, confident, full of attention. He had slipped into the gaps, filling them with laughter, with something that felt like excitement. She had felt alive again. Reborn. But now, looking back, it all seemed like a cheap imitation of what she had once shared with Matthew. What had she even been searching for? She had told herself she wanted freedom, a spark of mystery, something to remind her of who she used to be. But the feeling had slipped through her fingers like sand. Her phone lay beside her now, recharged, glowing softly in the dim room. The urge to call Matthew surged through her, an ache so strong it nearly stole her breath. She just needed to hear his voice. Even if he was angry. Even if he told her he never wanted to see her again. At least it would be real. Her fingers hovered over his number. Her heart pounded. But she hesitated. A sharp, twisting guilt coiled in her stomach. What could she even say to him? Her mind raced through possibilities, through apologies that felt too shallow, explanations that rang hollow. She could already hear his voice in her head, steady, cold. I gave you a chance, Amanda. You chose. The memory of his ultimatum hit her like a punch to the ribs. Midnight. She had crossed the line. And she didn't know if there was any way back. A soft knock shattered her spiraling thoughts. Amanda's head snapped up, her pulse hammering in her ears. She knew who it was. Tyler. Checking in on her. The only person left in this strange, fractured night. Amanda crossed the room and pulled open the door. Tyler stood there, his face shadowed with quiet concern, his eyes searching hers as if trying to decipher something unspoken. Couldn't sleep, he asked softly. She shook her head, stepping back as he entered. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing them inside the sterile, impersonal space. He lowered himself onto the edge of the bed, watching her with a quiet, patient solidarity. But there was something different between them now, an unspoken tension, a silent acknowledgement of just how fragile, how fleeting this connection truly was. Amanda, he began hesitantly, his voice uncertain. Are you okay with all this? She met his gaze, raw and unguarded, the exhaustion in her expression stripping away any attempt at pretense. I don't know what I am anymore, Tyler, she whispered, the words tumbling out in quiet surrender. I thought I was ready to leave it all behind. But now I'm not sure I ever really knew what I wanted. Tyler exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly, a flicker of understanding passing over his face. I think maybe, he said gently, you just wanted to feel something different. To escape. Amanda's gaze dropped to the floor, the truth settling over her like a weight she could no longer ignore. Escape. That's exactly what it had been. An escape from herself. From the slow erosion of her marriage. From the terrifying thought that maybe the fire had burned out long ago and would never return. But here she was, and all she felt was empty. Tyler's presence, once electric, once a thrill, now felt distant. A burden more than a comfort. A reminder of every step that had led her here. What are we even doing, Tyler? Her voice was quiet, fragile, laced with the exhaustion of realization. I don't even know if this was ever real for me. A flicker of hurt crossed his face before he masked it, forcing his expression into something calm, measured. I thought. He trailed off for a moment, then tried again. I thought maybe we had something. Maybe you just needed more time to see it. She shook her head, the words forming before she could stop them. I don't think time would change anything. The silence that followed was thick, unrelenting. A chasm that had always been there but was only now fully realized. Tyler gave a slow nod, pushing himself to his feet. The reality of her words cast a shadow over his face as he glanced around the stark hotel room, the temporary space that had become the setting for their mistakes. Maybe you're right, he said finally, his tone resigned but not unkind. Maybe I was just a distraction. Amanda swallowed hard, guilt threading through her voice. I didn't mean for this to happen, Tyler. I didn't mean to drag you into my mess. He let out a quiet, bitter chuckle, shaking his head. I think we both wanted it to happen. It's just, things never turn out the way we expect them to, do they? He stepped toward the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. If you need anything, I'll be down the hall. With one last look, he slipped out, the door clicking softly shut behind him. And just like that, she was alone again. The silence returned, colder this time, pressing in around her. She sank onto the bed, the weight of everything crashing over her. She had pushed Matthew away, pulled Tyler close, only to realize too late that neither of them could fill the void inside her. She was left with nothing but fragments. Of her past. Of the life she had built. Of the person she had become in pursuit of something she had never truly defined. Amanda curled up on the stiff mattress, drawing her knees to her chest as the first pale light of dawn seeped through the window. The morning felt foreign, unfamiliar. The first day of a life she no longer recognized. She lay there, still fully dressed, her eyes gritty from the sleepless night. The sunlight was harsh, spilling into the room and exposing every crack in her reality with painful clarity. For the first time in years, she felt truly alone. Not just in the way of being physically isolated, but in a deeper, more profound sense. It was as if the world had stripped away every illusion she had clung to, leaving her raw, emptied of pretense. A husk of the woman she had once been. A quiet knock at the door made Amanda's heart stutter, caught between a fleeting hope and a gnawing dread. For a split second, she allowed herself the impossible thought, that maybe it was Matthew. That he was standing there, softened by the early morning light, ready to undo the night, to take her back, to try again. But she knew better. That fantasy had died long before she ever walked out the door. Taking a steadying breath, she opened it. Tyler stood there, his expression etched with concern, though his gaze hovered just past her shoulder, as if sensing the invisible boundary that had settled between them overnight. "Hey," he said softly. "I just wanted to check in before I head out. Make sure you're okay." Amanda tried to summon a smile, but it felt brittle, barely holding together. "I'll be fine. Really. I need to figure things out." Tyler nodded, the understanding in his eyes laced with something heavier. "I get it. And I know last night wasn't easy. For either of us." A silence stretched between them, weighted with everything they had never truly said, with words that once seemed important but now rang hollow. The thrill she had once felt in his presence, the escape he had provided, was nothing more than another illusion, another step down a path she had walked blindly. And yet, standing here now, looking at him, she felt a quiet sense of relief. Whatever had passed between them had served its purpose, and now, it was time to let it go. "I'm sorry, Tyler," she murmured. "For dragging you into this. For everything." He tilted his head slightly, a sad, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You don't have to apologize. We both made choices." A pause. Then, with a softer tone, "Just, take care of yourself, okay?" She nodded. "You too." With one final look, Tyler turned and walked away, his footsteps fading down the dim hallway. Amanda watched him disappear, feeling a strange pang she couldn't quite name. But as the silence wrapped around her once more, she realized it wasn't his absence that hurt. It was the recognition of just how lost she had become in her search for something more. Later that morning, she found herself wandering aimlessly through the city streets, the hotel long behind her. The crisp air carried the scent of fresh rain, and the sidewalks glistened beneath the weak morning sun. She moved without direction, without purpose, her thoughts unraveling with each step, drifting through memories of Matthew, of the life they had built, of the love that had been there, solid, steady, before she let it slip through her fingers. At a small park tucked between a row of townhouses, she sank onto an empty bench, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She watched the world pass by, couples walking hand in hand, their quiet laughter an easy, effortless thing. Children ran ahead, their joy spilling into the still air, filling the silence with a bittersweet echo of everything she had left behind. Then, her phone buzzed. The sound jolted her, slicing through the fog in her mind. She pulled it from her pocket, her breath catching when she saw the name on the screen. Matthew. A message. For a moment, she simply stared, her pulse hammering as she hesitated, bracing herself for whatever words he had chosen to send. Finally, she opened it. Amanda, I've arranged for movers to pack up your things. Let me know where they can be sent. She read it once. Then again. Each word landed with a brutal, unmistakable finality. She had known this was coming. Had felt its inevitability creeping closer, settling over her like a storm cloud. But seeing it laid out in black and white, seeing proof that she was no longer a part of his life, was something else entirely. Amanda began typing a response, her fingers trembling over the screen. But every word felt inadequate, empty. She deleted it. Instead, she saved the message, tucking her phone back into her pocket as if holding onto it could preserve something of him, of them. As the hours drifted by, she wandered through the city, lost in a haze. Every street, every turn felt like a ghost of her past. She passed a bookstore Matthew had loved, its windows lined with dust-covered novels, their spines tilted and worn. A coffee shop they had once visited every Sunday sat just ahead, its patio filled with people lost in easy conversation, their laughter cutting through the morning quiet. She stood there for a moment, watching, her heart twisting at the realization that life hadn't stopped just because hers had unraveled. The city itself had become a graveyard of memories. Every corner, every street a reminder of something she could never reclaim. By late afternoon, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, Amanda found herself back in her hotel room. The stillness inside was suffocating, the walls pressing in as she collapsed onto the bed, the weight of the day sinking deep into her bones. She felt exposed, stripped bare. Every choice she had made stood before her, stark and unrelenting, a painful testament to all she had lost. And yet, in the hollow silence of that room, something unexpected settled over her. A strange, fragile calm. For the first time in months, maybe even years, she saw herself with unfiltered clarity. No more distractions. No illusions of fleeting excitement. No grand ideas of reinvention or escape. Just the raw, undeniable truth. In chasing what she thought she wanted, she had been blind to the quiet beauty of what she already had. A long, shuddering breath escaped her lips, her heart twisting at the weight of that realization. There was no easy road back. No quick way to repair what had been broken. But she couldn't stay lost in this sea of regret forever. The road ahead would be uncertain. The choices would be hard. But for the first time, they would be hers, and hers alone. As the first stars blinked into the evening sky beyond the window, Amanda lay back against the stiff mattress, her eyes wide open, unflinching. She had lost Matthew. She had walked away from the life they had built together. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way forward. A way to rebuild. A way to exist, not in borrowed moments or restless longing, but in something real. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself imagine what that might look like. Alone. Yes. But finally, unmistakably, real.